Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Tuesday, August 11th, 2020. And tonight's topic is how to restore trust between you and your child. Like a lot of our broadcasts, I think that there's some non-intuitive ideas that we can bring into this work tonight. I think that there's a lot of messages from our culture that in all cases, we they deserve our critical attention. That we need to unlearn things in order to become a more aware, more enlightened parent, father, mother, spouse, and child. So we're going to talk about those kind of non-intuitive things as we go along tonight, and kind of challenge some of the assumptions that we're asked to take on from the culture. Uh, from the journey of the heroic parent, where I say artificially letting go and forgiving because you feel that you should or because you think you must can be a dangerous thing for both you and your child. When I was asked to do this presentation, and I've been asked to do this for a few different times, I think that there is this sense from parents. There are really two ideas that I'm going to key on at the outset. The first one is that we're under some kind of obligation to trust our child, right? That there's some kind of rush or imperative to trust our children, when in fact, I think it's okay to not trust our children. To lay that distrust upon them emotionally can be very damaging, right? But to have a boundary based on that lack of trust can be a healthy thing. And I'll talk more about that as we go along this evening. But the first idea that I want to untangle is the idea that you don't have to trust your child. That's the first thought or idea, that there's no requirement. But I do want to talk about a shift between talking about or telling or nagging or complaining or shaming or guilting the child. I think all of those expressions of distrust can be very harmful, but a boundary is not inherently shameful. A boundary is you taking care of you, and we'll talk about that emphasis tonight. The boundary being something where you're demonstrating self-care as a point of focus this evening. So that's the first idea, is that there's no necessary obligation or rush to trust your child. The second idea is that trusting your child doesn't ensure that things will turn out the way that you want. I think this is one of the most under considered ideas in the area of trust. I have a lot of parents who will talk to me about outpatient therapists, who will talk about previous statements, advice that they've received from people in parenting. And one of the things that they often hear people suggesting, trust your child more. And I think what comes along with that suggestion is the implication that if you do trust your child, that everything's going to go well, that they're going to, in other words, live up to that trust. I have a little bit of a different idea. Trusting your child doesn't ensure that things will turn out the way that you want. Trusting is something larger, more profound and spiritual, has a bigger, it's got a bigger frame than that. Trusting may often result in lessons learned for both parents and the child as they navigate choices and difficulties. In other words, if the goal, and this is kind of a basic premise that I speak from, if the goal is to raise a child to be a healthy self, then trust is a word for the space that I give them to kind of sort it out, which is going to include stepping back, forward, sideways. It's going to include making choices that I would consider not the healthiest or the best choices. The trust is deeper. It's the process. The trust is that they'll figure it out as they go, even as they make poor choices. But if the suggestion to trust your child, which oftentimes many outpatient therapists suggest, if the implication that comes along with that is that your child will then make every decision that you want them to, then it's really a fool's errand. It's a big mistake because children are in the business of kind of messing things up, of making mistakes, of figuring themselves out. I'm like you. I'm like all of us that the most important lessons that can report to you are the ones that have come almost exclusively from my mistakes. I would like to say that half or most of the lessons that I've learned of value have come from my successes. Those are a part of it, but I've learned a lot of things from my mistakes. And so trust is something spiritual. It's when I say it's something larger, it's almost more of a trust in a higher power or in radical acceptance or the universe, whatever your framework is. It's trust that everything is going to be okay, that we'll sort this out. And that sometimes the shortest distance between where you are and where you want to go is a very crooked line, a very messy line. Now, the third thing that I'm going to talk about tonight as a premise, and I didn't list it in one of these first couple of slides as a quote, but I want to emphasize it. I've said this for years now. I think when we talk about trust with our children, we tend to think in one direction. We tend to think in terms of, do we trust them? What I don't think we think enough of is, do they trust us? And I think that direction might be more important and might be something that if we focus on, we'll do well to heal our relationship with the child, to look at ourselves, to grow, to be self-critical in a healthy way going forward. So let's talk about trust. First of all, again, similar to that idea of some kind of imperative that you should trust your child, um, there's this idea that you can earn trust, right? It's not completely misguided. But the problem with the idea that you can earn trust is that no two people have the same exact measure of trust. Right? There are general ideas, but you have a right to trust or to not trust anybody. Some of it might come from your history. Some of it might have less to do with the present situation. But when we talk about with children, when we talk about earning trust and when we talk about people earning trust, we're really putting the control on the wrong person. We're saying you can do certain things that will unequivocally, objectively speaking, make me trust you. We think that, we teach it, it's in our culture. But the fact of the matter is, I get to trust you when I'm ready to trust you. And maybe I've been hurt. Or maybe there's something in the dynamic between us that speaks to me that I can't put a finger on, but that leads me to not trust you. So I think when we talk about trust, when I'm talking to your children, I'm saying to them, assume that your parents are crazy. Assume that I'm crazy. And do what you need to do. Do the right thing, for lack of a better word. Do the right thing and let the chips fall where they may. But if you focus on earning trust, I remember I had one student, I was reading that first letter, we call it a hopes and intentions letter now. We were reading that first letter, and in that letter there was this story about some jewelry that had been lost and suspected, stolen and sold. And at a moment during the group, the child confessed that this long-standing disagreement with mom and dad about the jewelry being stolen, that he finally copped to it. I stole it. I sold it for money. I used it for my girlfriend and my friends. So, we encouraged and reinforced that. And thanks for coming clean. And he wrote in his letter coming home. His parents found the jewelry the next week behind the dresser, the specific item that had been missing for maybe months, if not weeks. And I said to him, why did you lie? He said, well, I thought if I lied, I would earn your trust. So you can hear it in that example. If earning a trust is, what do I need to do to get you to trust me? And I'm in control of that. And the shift that I ask people to make is all you're in control of is whether or not you tell the truth, whether or not you're honest and have integrity. It's up to the person whether they trust you or not. Lots of parents don't trust children who other parents would trust that same child. We start to shift between this away from this mathematical equation about trust into this personal ownership. I get to trust who I get to trust. Now, most of us were told when we were children growing up, and our culture reinforces this, is that there are objective measures of trust, but that's just not true. And we'll never agree on it. And that's what people are arguing about all of the time. That's what children are arguing with parents about. I've done enough to earn your trust. I've done A, B, C, D, E, F. And the parent says, well, I'm not going to trust you until G, H, and I. So we learn to speak from an I place. We learn to own the process. There's this idea that children are entitled to it. Right? I think it comes along with that same energy that we should rush to trust our children. Nobody's entitled to trust. I talk about, and I was thinking about this in preparation for this evening. I talk about the adult or the parent brain. You know, you run the information through your brain, through your parent. Ideally, you're operating from a parent or an adult brain, and then you make your decision about where you stand with somebody. In fact, this is a really, really, really important principle. When folks in your life are accountable, and you'll know this if you've seen it before, when people are truly accountable, they will have a tremendous amount of patience for your distrust. Folks that are accountable don't require you to trust them in a hasty, quick, efficient manner. They'll often say, I get it. You don't have to. I wouldn't if I was you. And here's the irony. When somebody lets go of the control of getting you to trust them, you tend to trust them more. And so this control that we have over each other, that we exercise over each other about trust is part of the problem. People ask, will my lack of trust make them feel a certain way? Again, there's a difference between not trusting you and kind of layering it on. You know, talking about it, lecturing, nagging, guilting, shaming. That kind of discussion and dialogue can be very harmful, can leave pretty dramatic dents and bruises. But to just own your space and your trust, it's okay. When you own it, you make it about you. And then I'll talk about this as we go into it. And then you can start to sort out for yourself in your own therapy with your sponsor, the mentors that you're working with, the people that you trust, the other adults in your life, and you start to sort it out. Like, does this come? Maybe my brother was, this reminds me of my brother, or he was an addict. Or my ex-spouse was depressed and bipolar in this way, and it reminds me of that old behavior. Or my mother, right? My father, whatever it might be. You sort that out in therapy. You start to make sense of it. You unpack your own trauma, because our own trauma can affect our trust of other people. And since none of us are Yoda, we're going to fall, objectively speaking, too far one way or the other on the continuum, right? Because we have wounds. And all of this gets entered into the equation about whether or not we trust. But part of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to deconstruct the idea that there's this simple formula for trust, that if you follow, everything will work out. This is another example of a parenting idea that we can manualize therapy, that we can dictate therapy, and there's no work involved. This is part of the work of becoming a self. And you all know this. Those of you who are doing your work, you know that as you do your work, you're absolutely aware that you get more clear about how you feel and where your boundaries are. and they're not open for debate or negotiation. You're not rigid, you're just clear. So if you're too cynical, too Pollyannish, too optimistic, too pessimistic, should you let go of it? That's what you work out for yourself. Working with a therapist or a sponsor that you trust to unpack your own trauma. And really, that's the trauma, the wounding is what gets in the way of our clarity, right? Of all the work that we do. As you sort out your own trauma with those other adults in your life, you get more and more clear about where you stand. You're also willing to take risks. The trauma response is I'm gonna be really, really rigid with my trust. Be really I'm gonna parse out my trust in a very limited way because I don't want to get hurt again. That's a trauma response. Or trusting too much can be a trauma response, right? It can grow if you grow up in a chaotic home where there's a lot of abuse, right? From parents, there might be substance abuse or other mental illness, then you're going to be likely to trust too much. So you can see in those two examples, trusting too little, too much is the result of trauma. And so we got to sort that out. We got to do our work. And like a lot of things in parenting, children can use this to kind of manipulate you. In the long run, in the long run, children are going to benefit from their parents doing their work. We know that. But in the short run, it really does take away the power that they have over you. The unhealthy, inappropriate power that they have over you, right? Because if they know that you need to be a good parent, then that's what they're going to withhold from you unless you do what they want. It's not a conscious thing. In psychology, this would be akin to a theory called object relations theory. I don't suspect that most of your children, if any of them, have studied object relations theory, but they intuitively know to withhold from you the reinforcement that you need. And so then you end up kind of responding to your woundedness, asking for from your children something you should have gotten from your parents, which is a sense that you're okay. So in the short run, the boundaries, the work that you do will be threatening to them. They won't like that. In the long run, it'll be liberating. It'll be part of the growth for both of you and the growth in the relationship. There's a great book. I've done a broadcast on it by Harriet Lerner called "Why Won't You Apologize?" If you want, somebody to go through kind of the anatomy of the apology and the mistakes that can be made, I've talked about that. I did a podcast with Dr. Lerner a few months ago where we talked about that a bit. You're welcome to go to that, and she really gets into the details, the small brushstrokes of it. But most importantly, like I said earlier, that forgiveness and trust come on the terms of the person who's been hurt, not on the person who's done the hurting. So in other words, you have permission, therapeutic permission to take your time and to do it on your terms. It's absolutely okay. And maybe the other most important idea here, the other important premise is, like I said, is do they trust you? I don't think we ask that enough. Are we a safe person? Do we have enough of a foundation, a base? Can we listen without judgment? Are we owning and working out our own anxiety? Right? All of those things become really, really important in the relationship. And so, first off, I would say if you're starting to think about trust, at least ask yourself, do they trust me? And what do I need? Malia, there's some folks asking some questions. See if what your thoughts about the questions are in the moderated chat. Um, and part of it is you figuring out what you can hold. You get to decide, you get to manage it, you get to decide what you're willing to risk in this process. But you have to own it. And we don't want to own things, right? We don't want to own our choice. We want to make it out there. We want to make it objective. We want to blame, in other words, how we're feeling and what we're doing on somebody else. And so those are the kinds of discussions that we have. The shift that we make in this kind of recovery that I talk about and teach about is that we start to own our feelings, own our boundaries, own ourselves, own our process. That's the growth in this process. Talk about permission, talk about privileges, talk about kind of behaviorally kind of extending yourself. Let's talk about permission for a minute. Like I said earlier, one of the ideas that I talk about pretty consistently is this idea that we've got to value the struggles and the mistakes. Our inability, our reluctance to value the struggles, the missteps, the mistakes, that again comes from our trauma, comes from our aversion to pain, which comes from our trauma. So somebody just asked the question. I want to address it because it could be a distraction if I don't. Somebody just asked the question: is there always some trauma in the parent's history? Is it possible that the parent doesn't have big T or little t that is a factor in how we engage, connect with our children? My quick answer that'll sound kind of funny is no, it's not possible to not have big T or small t trauma, because my definition of trauma is anything less than ideal. And nobody had an ideal childhood 24/7, year after year after year. And if it's just about a lack of information, that gets rectified real quickly. But we don't think of trauma at Evoke like, I don't think of it like these big dramatic moments. I just think about these wounds, these unhealed events, dynamics in our lives, and they're more often subtle, small t trauma. So it's not a big thing. It's not about mental illness. It's just about being human. It's why I and you am not enlightened, right? That's because we've experienced a less than optimal world, which is just part of being human. So part of the shift in this work, it's interesting what happens at Evoke, because you come here, your child's in crisis, you're in crisis, you place the child. The child does their work separately, you do your work. And in the end, on the other side of all of this treatment, you have more bandwidth. You have better ears with which to hear and better eyes with which to see. You have more insight and awareness. You're less in denial, but you're more willing to tolerate the zigzag. You're less afraid of the mistakes or the missteps. I've shared this before, but it's just a simple example that I saw somewhere in the news about the CEO for the clothing company Spanx, which some of you I'm sure have heard of. She said when she was growing up, her father used to ask the children at the table, share the mistakes that you made today. And if you didn't make a mistake that day, the dad would kind of act disappointed. And if you made a mistake, he would celebrate it. And he was trying to train the children of the value of leaning into the mistakes and that there's no shame in it. And really, he's teaching his children how to be good artists, good business folks, good parents, good partners. Because part of it is our humanity, our humanness, right? That's what fills out the beautiful parts of us as we kind of bump our way along. And so we develop more of a capacity to tolerate that with our children. We develop a greater ability to handle what I call our empathic misery, letting them struggle. We don't see a struggle as a something we need to fix. We don't see that pain and the anger that often comes from it towards us as a reflection of us because we've done our work. So part of our ability to be present and solid with our children is built upon, first and foremost, our own family of origin experience. But then as we do this work, it's built on the work that we do in therapy to unravel that experience. You see your child more clearly when you have a foundation that's firm. And when you see your child more clearly, it's based on a sense of differentiation between the two of you. It's like my favorite quote from Gandhi, where he said, "A coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is the prerogative of the brave. Projection, fusion, and going home is easy. Loving another's otherness is heroic. And if we love other as other, if we love other as other, we have heroically taken on the responsibility of our own differentiation and our own journey. And this heroism may properly be called love. In other words, if love becomes a measure of our capacity, then it takes work and healing and awareness. It takes, according to Gandhi, and I happen to agree with him, it takes a commitment to sorting out our own journey. Or what he says, also synonymously, our own differentiation, which is where I stop and where you start. We start to take a we'll see attitude. I encourage parents to kind of don't be in a rush to arrive at conclusions every moment. Parents learn the phrase catastrophizing, right? They learn that in this process, don't they? To not catastrophize, to project into the future. I've had that struggle. When I first started doing wilderness therapy, my two oldest children were very, very young. They're now 25 and 27. And so when they were young and I would see various behaviors, I was projecting them into a wilderness program 10, 15, 20 years later. It's kind of part of the consequence of doing the work that I do. But the practice that I encourage is you take a we'll see attitude. Some of you have heard this famous allegory. I forget where I first heard about it, where it was first reported, but I'll give you the basis of it, where a man in a village loses his horse. And the neighbor comes and said, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible. You've lost your horse. It's your livelihood." And the man says to his neighbor, he says, "Well, it could be good, could be bad, too early to tell." A couple of days later, this horse comes back leading a whole herd of horses. So now the man is the richest in the kingdom. And his neighbor comes to him and she says, "Oh my gosh, you've now have the most horses in the kingdom. You're a rich man." He says, "Well, could be good, could be bad, too early to tell." While his oldest son is trying to break one of the horses, he's trampled and ends up losing the ability to walk. The neighbor comes again and says, "This is horrible." Man says, "Could be good, could be bad, too early to tell." Eventually, the army comes through and they draft every young man to war. But because his son is crippled, incapable of walking, he's not then drafted. And then the army goes off and everybody dies in battle in this allegory. And the point is, we just don't know. We'll see. I mean, that's part of why I say trust is a bigger process. It's bigger than we think. It's really about a spiritual relationship. So we take a we'll see attitude. We learn to react slowly and deliberately. In brain science, they call it being able to have response flexibility. A non-trauma response is deliberate and slow. A trauma response is knee-jerk and quick and rigid. As you go along, you pay less attention to promises, apologies, or goals stated. You just get curious. When my young children tell me about their grand plans, my response is, we'll see. It doesn't matter to me. You know, part of it is when somebody's trying to sell me something, I immediately become a non buyer. It's the same with me. You'll know if I'm committed to my self care if I'm out there doing it. But telling you about it, teaching about it, giving you Instagram quotes about it don't really make a difference. You'll know it if I'm doing it. There's this thing I call reverse accountability. I used to always say, and the example I used was I would do anything to learn. I would do anything to play the guitar. I would love to play the guitar. And I would do anything except for take lessons and practice. That's what I've said my whole life. But now I'm taking lessons and practicing. I used to ask the kids, how much do you think I weigh? It made them very uncomfortable. And since my weight has been a battle for me, it fluctuates greatly. But I would ask the students, I'd say, how much do you think I weigh? And they would usually take a very kind guess. And then I would tell them the truth about how much I weighed at that moment. And then I'd say, how much do you think I want to weigh? That'd be my next question. And they'd look at me and they'd see my belly sticking out and my double chin, and they'd take off 30 pounds. And I would say to them, I want to weigh exactly how much I weigh. I don't have any medical conditions. I know how to be more fit and healthy. And I know what it takes. And so, sure, I would love to be in great shape. I would do anything to be in great shape except for exercise and eat better. I used to run Ironman triathlons and marathons. And race day was easy. Race day was the best. I loved race day. I miss race day. But the hardest thing was a Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. doing my track workout in the drizzling rain. Right? That's running a marathon. By the time the race day comes, it's just, by that time, it is what it is. So reverse accountability is we start to take responsibility for where we are in life. If you haven't watched the documentary Finding Joe, I recommend it to everybody listening. Finding Joe. You can find it. He put it on he put it on YouTube during the pandemic. Finding Joe. And one of the things they talk about in there is this idea that when we wake up in a body that we don't like, in a relationship that we don't want, in a job that we don't really like, when we wake up and realize that and take responsibility for that, we start to demonstrate a kind of power. So backing off from your children, just what I like to say is hold on to it lightly. I remember some years ago, my wife and I were talking, and my wife gets very, very curious she's really good at this. This is her strength compared to mine. She'll ask lots of questions about the child. She wants to get inside of their mind, right? Sometimes for me, that can be maddening because they're kids and they're crazy. So to follow their thought process sometimes is frustrating for me. And we were driving not too far from here. We're driving, it was a date night. Remember those? We were going out to dinner. And my wife started to tell me about one of my children and their thought process. And I said to her, I can't do this. I can't listen to every bit of reasoning from the child. I have to hold it a little bit with a lighter grip. I'm not going to be in denial. I'm not going to ignore things, but I can't get into it with them. I can have boundaries. I can have limits, but I can't get into the madness, the insanity of it. I have to hold it with a light grip. So you start to hold your children with a light grip. You start to hold what they say with a light grip. What they promise, what they apologize for with a light grip. That's why the letters that they write to you, you get a sense when they're writing to their parents, like, how much energy is there about this apology? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to convince the parent of? And you can contrast that energy from when a child just starts telling the truth, talking about their struggles, their successes. I would say to clients often, I would say, you're not as free in your writing with your parents about the mistakes and struggles you're having as you are with the successes that you're having. I wonder why that is. This week you had some really valuable and important mistakes that you made and went through, some struggles that I have a lot of empathy for, but you're not talking about those in the letters. I wonder why. I wonder why you're pointing out and talking about all the successes that you have with a much greater ease. In the end, you're not perfect, but you are in charge and you're responsible for the decisions. You have to own them, right? I love this principle of handling the no as well as the yes. I learned this from working with clients in the wilderness years ago. They would be making a case for a privilege, what I call a yes. Think of whatever it is. Coming home, think of whatever the privilege is. I want this privilege. I want this yes. And I realized, especially because so much of our discussions in therapy were about going home. And parents and sometimes students would say, why are we talking about this all the time? Why are we talking about going home all the time? That's not, at home, that's not a discussion. And I would say it's just about a boundary. It's about your parents being able to say no. First off, it's about them being able to say no. Second of all, it's about how you handle the no. And if you can handle the yes, then you can handle the no. But you have to do battle with your own guilt. I've said this many, many times. Guilt is an unreliable source of morality. It's a liar. Guilt is not a North Star for morality or truth. Guilt will lie to you just as often as it will tell you the truth. Guilt is a sensation or a feeling that we have that we are going to hurt somebody, that somebody's going to be upset. And hundreds of times, parents have said to me, I've known the right thing to do and I didn't do it. And I'll ask why. And their answer is often because I felt guilty. If you're not battling guilt, I know this for myself. If we're not battling guilt, we're not making progress morally. In fact, I know for myself, if I'm not doing battle with guilt, I'm not doing good with boundaries and self-care. Because healthy self-care and boundaries will come with a dramatic dose of guilt. It just will. So battling guilt is a part of it. And again, it comes from that family of origin, those mistakes that were passed down to us through our parents, from their parents, and so on and so on and so on. We have to kind of find a different source of truth, a different source of awareness, of enlightenment. And that's part of what therapy can do. Therapy can give you a different source, a deeper source. I've talked about this, about how controlling parenting is trying to convince them that you are right and they are wrong. Like, if I can just convince my child or my spouse that they're wrong, then I won't have to set a boundary. So I spend a lot of energy trying to convince everybody around me that the way I see things is the right way to see things. And then I don't have to do the difficult work of boundaries, and I don't have to face the dragon of guilt. And explaining ourselves explaining our boundaries is evidence of self-doubt. A client was just asking me recently how I respond to a whole bunch of shoulds that she's receiving in her life. And I said, first of all, I said, on my good days or my bad days, how would I respond? But I said, the fact of the matter is, on my good days, I wouldn't justify myself. I wouldn't try to convince you. Our explanations, when paired with boundaries to try to convince others that our boundaries are justified and right, are not evidence of strength. they're evidence of self-doubt. Forgiveness, there's lots of discussions around forgiveness. I tend to think of forgiveness as kind of a natural evolution, right? That I have to go through anger and hurt oftentimes to get to forgiveness. Sometimes forgiveness comes easier for me than other times. Just recently at one of our Finding You intensives, for example, one of the participants was in awe of somebody else's ability to give their parents grace, to compliment. They complimented their peer because this peer was understanding of their parents' dilemmas, and that's why they treated them the way that they treated them. And I said, be careful of that. As a parent, ideally, I don't need my children to understand where my limitations come from. I don't want that to be their burden. I don't want them to understand how my parents raised me so that they can forgive me. I don't need that, ideally. What I want for them is I want them to be able to feel hurt and angry at me and to be able to express it and be able to listen to it. And so we move through our feelings, and our children move through their feelings when they're allowed to feel it. One of the questions that gets asked of us all the time is, will my child forgive me? And my response is, they will when they grow up, if they grow up. And your best contribution to them forgiving you is letting them not forgive you. If you need them to forgive you, then they're taking care of you. It's not that I don't understand that. I understand it. I have some of those wounds also. But when we're talking about the ideal or the project, we let them have their feelings. Am I stuck in my anger with my child? Am I getting resentful? Resentment can be often a sign of poor boundaries. If I'm setting healthy boundaries, I'm not resentful. If I'm stuck in my anger, then I need some help. And it will often not be the child that will help me get over it. The question, should I get over it or when should I get over it? Anytime the word should is in a question, it's already lost its credibility. The answer is, of course, you have a right, they have a right to feel. You both have a right to feel. And it's really, 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 really hard to forgive somebody when the bad behavior is still happening. I want to be clear about that. I've seen people say, I should forgive my father or my spouse or my parent, whatever it is. And I've made the comment to them, but the abuse is still happening. Forgiveness is really hard to get to, but it's almost impossible when the abuse is still happening. And that's how misguided I think our ideas about forgiveness are, is that we think we need to forgive people while we're still being abused by them, mistreated. So in this way of thinking, this kind of differentiated way of thinking that we're talking about at Evoke, nobody's obligated to feel anything for anybody else, ideally. But we encourage ownership of it. Working with your Evoke therapist, working with a therapist at home, a mentor or sponsor at home to help differentiate between your relationship with your child and other people in your life, like your siblings, your parents, your ex-spouse, your co-parent. Right? That's a part of the work. That can cloud and affect the relationship you have with your child. Our relationships with others are built upon the foundation of the clarity of the relationship we have with ourselves, which means our history, our wounds, our healings, our messages from family of origin, and so forth. Right? All of that is a precursor, that's the lead to the development of the relationship with somebody else. Back to the question of will your child will forgive you, and my answer being they will when they grow up. You've all dented your children. Sometimes maybe you've done something intentional. Most of it unintentional. Maybe transporting them was a mistake. Maybe sending them to Evoke was a mistake. Maybe you were too hard, too soft, too whatever, right? Like that's just life. You don't get to win. You don't get to be good. You just get to be you. And it becomes your child's job to forgive you, not for your sake, but for their sake as they grow up. You know, if we struggle with resentment and anger that stays in us, we're the ones who pay for it. And I'm always in this process at Evoke, I'm always encouraging people to pause, to slow down and consider not moving too fast through the hurt and through the anger because I'm suspicious of it. And my suspicions are that we're being asked to hold our parents' egos, that we're being asked to carry our parents' defenses. Because what I know as a father is, especially as I've done my work, is I have dented my children chronically over the years. And what I want for them, what I think is important for them is that they sort that out. And not for my sake. And not to forgive me so that I feel okay. And not to make sense out of my life and my traumatic childhood so that they don't think I'm a bad guy, a bad dad. I'll work on that so they can just be themselves. To distinguish between punishing and consequence, right? If we're more hurt, more angry, then our behavioral responses are going to be more punitive and punishing. And in the end, the decision to trust again, to let down the wall, is to risk being hurt again. And there are times and situations when you would be a fool. It would be unwise to trust again, and unwise to forgive if that forgiveness includes, by its definition in your mind, letting the person back in. Part of it is, did they really do it to you? And what I mean by that is it about you? This forgiveness piece, going back to the child. I've seen this quote, which I really like, which says that mental health is the realization that how other people treat me, think about me, and regard me is more a reflection of the relationship that they have with themselves and not with me. And so part of it is that, when they lie to you, it's not about you. Taking it personally is probably not beneficial for either one of you. So did they really do it to you? And I believe the more we grow, the more we don't take it personally. If you've read the book, The Four Agreements, which is a very popular self-help / spiritual book, one of the agreements that he encourages us to adopt in our lives is don't take anything personally. If I adore you, it's not about you. If I punch you in the nose, even he says in the book, it's not about you. So as we grow as parents, how our children treat us is more of a reflection of the relationship they have with themselves, not with us. And we don't take it personally. And I've seen parents make tremendous progress in this area with children who have treated them very poorly. They're not repressing or denying the hurt and the anger from their children. They don't feel it because it's not about them. It goes right through them. We talk about how resentment is a way to cover up our more vulnerable feelings of hurt and fear and sadness, right? That at the core, in our most sensitive places, really hurt, the fear, the sadness, the grief, the loss. Those are kind of the most pure feelings. But anger is kind of like hurt and sad's bodyguard. It always covers up something else. And it's an effective reminder of us to set healthy boundaries. I said this earlier, but I want to make it more clear. Resentment is usually a sign that you or I are not setting good boundaries. Think about that for a while. Resentment is evidence of poor boundary setting. Resentment is the broken hope that you'll treat me well. But if I learn to set healthy boundaries in our relationship, I can let go of the resentment. If I can learn to take care of myself and all that that implies, then I don't need to feel resentful. I was talking to a dad years ago. I was asking him how he felt, and he didn't want to have that discussion. He didn't think anything that he was expressing was about his feeling. Feelings are driving things. It's why we ask you how you feel all the time. Feelings are the fuel that drive us. And so if we don't sort those things out, if we don't unpack ourselves, what's going on inside. I was talking in our in-service this morning with our field staff about how the I feel statements and the feedback process is, it's not so much the tool or the skill. We're giving kids these tools so they can understand what's going on inside of them. And our fear and our hurt and our anger are powerful motivators. I talked about resentment, anger, and the costs of it. It comes at a great cost for us if it's chronic and stagnant. We learn to forgive for our sake, not the other person's. Our children learn to forgive us because if they don't, they keep waiting for us to be the perfect parent. They learn to forgive us because if they don't, they keep expecting something that we're not going to give. They learn to forgive so they can move on to find other sources of parenting. Forgiveness is a gift that we give to ourselves. Don't rush it. There's no moral imperative in it. Doesn't make you a better person. Just like having a healthy knee doesn't make you a better person versus having a broken knee. And if forgiveness must include the definition of letting the person back in your life, then it's a distorted idea of forgiveness in my book. And there's this great quote. I used it in my most recent book about boundaries. It reminds me of this. I found it on somebody's social media, and I got permission. I think I gave them credit on their website because they just put it on their social media. But it said a healthy boundary is the distance. A healthy boundary is the distance between me and you in which I can love you and me simultaneously. Sometimes that's far away, right? The goal is to have compassion and serenity. And if I can't live with you and maintain that, then we might need to have other arrangements made. Like I said, if forgiveness reminds you, or if it robs you of your boundaries, then it's a problematic definition in my book. Should I forgive it, forget it? Again, you're allowed to take care of yourself. You would be a fool to forget things often. Being honest with yourself and letting go is different than denial. I see parents go on this kind of a curvilinear relationship in this work. At first, they're in denial, and then things blow up. And then they're very, very clear. They almost become like detectives, right? And then as they kind of peak and come down the other side, they start to allow for mistakes. They start to allow for wiggle room. Not in denial, not ended up feeling like resentful, angry, disappointed, destroyed, but they develop a capacity, a bandwidth. And that's kind of the growth curve that I see with parents, from denial to awareness to a hyper awareness to letting go to detaching. And sometimes our lack of forgiving we can confuse that with forgiving. Forgiving has with it the lack of forgiveness has with it, in my definition, it's not the right definition, it's just mine. It has kind of a resentment, an anger, a kind of an energy that keeps us stuck. And am I confusing forgetting with forgiving? Forgetting has no emotional content necessarily. Forgetting means if I'm in a relationship with an alcoholic or a drug addict who keeps stealing from me, I'm going to have a boundary, and I'm not going to forget that this is what is going on. A lack of forgiveness means I'm still going to be resentful, still going to be hoping for them to change, clinging, attaching my serenity to their behavior. Like I said before, making it about us. There's ego in making it about us. And taking care of yourself is the challenge. As always, I think when we ask these questions, like questions about trust as an example, that we try to flip it around. What does your regression look like? What do your triggers look like? What does it look like for you to go backwards? Stay away from all or nothing, back to square one type of thinking, and then learning to value the mistakes. So the take-home messages are boundaries are about managing self-care, not about controlling other people. They do teach other people the lessons, but the primary goal of boundaries is self-care. Resentment and anger are often signs of poor self-care. Own your feelings. That includes your trust and your forgiveness. You don't have to be right. You get to feel what you feel. You know what you need to know, but you don't have to talk it out with them. You know, it's not for them to agree with you or not. They're allowed to hate it, disagree, and think you're old-fashioned, neurotic, stupid. Slow down your rush to judgment, positive or negative. I think when we rush to judgment, we're assuming that our children have fully developed brains, right? We're applying kind of rational thought to them, and for the most part, especially those that struggle with addictions and mental illness, they don't have a healthy rational thought process. So take a step back, detach, run it through the parent or the adult filter. Slow down, hold it lightly. Letting go of what they think in order to live your truth. Avoid shaming them and telling them not to feel. Don't think of it as a virtue for them to forgive you. Don't think of it as a virtue for them to understand your dilemma so that they can make sense. We don't want them to say, yeah, he abused me, but he had good intentions. That is the reasoning of a person who stays in an abusive relationship. Be informed by what they say, but not controlled by it. Listen and ask yourself questions. Again, it's the parent, the adult filter, the adult brain. Hold it lightly. And then get help. I mean, you all know this because I talk about this all the time. You just do your work. Not because you have to, not because anything is your fault, but just because it's freedom. It's power. You do your work because it frees you from unconscious obligations, from guilt, from shame, from fear. You do your work because you disentangle the messages of your dominant culture, wherever you grew up. You become critical of the messages in your family. By critical, I don't mean negative. I mean, you look at them critically. There's no normal family. There's no one right way to be. And this journey that we're on is really the journey of the discovery of who we are, of being ourselves. And that involves unlearning. More than anything, it involves unlearning, deconstruction. All right, I can take a couple of questions. Looks like I've gone over. Maybe we can save questions. I'll take a couple of questions, Malia. It looks like Malia has also shared with you the Finding Joe link. Thank you, Malia. Somebody asked the questions, how do we begin to restore trust with our son who has for years stolen from us, his sisters, his peers, etc.? and upon going to Evoke, still stood by his decision, stating he didn't care and that the stealing benefited him. Again, like I've been talking about tonight, this question was probably put up early. Don't be in a rush. Take your time. He doesn't sound trustworthy. Why would you try to trust somebody who doesn't sound trustworthy? And then the second element of trusting is I've learned to trust my children. And what I mean by that is I know that they're lying to me. Right? I'm not trusting them like I believe them. I'm like, the trust is more of a manifestation of I'm going to give you a wide berth to figure this out. So trust is not, in this case, an emotional attachment to the truth of things. It's the trust is more like I'm going to give you some wiggle room, some margin for error, so that you can discover it. Now I'm not going to take it personal. I have a parent that did some amazing work, and after years, wrote a letter apologizing to her son for taking the lies personally, for making it about her, confronting the son as if it was a personal act. And I didn't tell this parent to do that. It wasn't suggested. She did it because her vision, her bandwidth, her sense of self grew to the point where that she wasn't like Don Miguel Ruiz says in the Four Agreements, she wasn't taking it personally anymore. Someone says, can you please explain what our boundaries should be? I still don't get boundaries. I've done a few. That's one of the hardest things, by the way. I want you to know that. I have a couple of podcasts on boundaries. Listen to those. Listen to them a couple of times. Malia, I don't know if you have a second to pull up some of the podcasts, or all of these are on YouTube also, the YouTube links for boundaries, but I have a few of them. Boundaries are about what I feel comfortable with. Boundaries are communicated when I say, this is what I'm okay with. And if you go over the line, this is what I'm going to do. It's about self-care. So that's the short answer. The long answer is in the couple of, I've done a few of the podcasts about that. Look at boundaries. The book, and I did a webinar podcast on it by Harriet Lerner called The Dance of Anger. It's my favorite book on boundaries, The Dance of Anger. The title is a little bit misleading. You'll get it once you read it, but it's my favorite book on boundaries. I'll take one more question before we wrap, and then we'll save the rest of the questions for next time. All right, folks, while I'm waiting for that question to come through, if you want to do your own work, a deep dive, intensives are now online. You can also do them in person. We have special protocols for safety for COVID. So the next in-person one, it's a 4.5-day process when it's in person. It's September 16th through 20th. You have to come in a day early to get tested, and all of our staff get tested too. If you want to do it online, I did not believe they could be as good as they are, and they're amazing online also. Those only go 2.5 days. September 23rd is the next one. Actually, that's a Finding You 2. The Finding You 2 online is September 23rd through 25th. Our staff are wonderful. We also have a new program we're announcing right now, which is called Embracing You. This is for women of color exclusively. It's a 4-day online intensive. Actually, it's 3 days. 3-day online intensive. Finding You online, just go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. They are great. They are the deep dive into this work. If you want to do a Pursuits adventure trip with your child, we have therapeutic staff-led trips. Think Sober Fun or therapeutically supported adventure trip. We've had a couple of people do these because we're not open for parent visits. They've used the Pursuits program, which is a separate program from our wilderness program, as a time to spend some time with the support with their child in between Evoke and the next step. Contact Sarah, without an H, Sara, Sarah@evoketherapy.com. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Adult Children, Refuge Recovery.org, or NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. You can also go to get resources and classes. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just find it by searching Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. They're also available on your computer on soundcloud.com under the same name, Finding You, an Evoke Therapy Podcast. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find us by using the handle @EvokeTherapy. You can also find us, our intensive program, on Instagram and by searching @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. You can find the Family Foundation by going to evokefamilyfoundation.org and on Facebook, and of course our blog. My book I've submitted. I'm just waiting for the approval. So any day now, the audiobook will be out. I did it in my voice this time. My first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon and also on iTunes. You can get it there too. The digital version. And my next book, The Audacity to Be You, is available on Amazon. And the audiobook, like I said, will be on Audible and on iTunes soon as they approve it, as long as I didn't mess up. Okay, it looks like I have time for one more question. Someone says, I don't have a problem with saying no, but his reaction to the no. I struggle with not getting caught up in the justification for the no to get him to be okay with it. Then this leaks over into boundaries. If he does not agree with me, not agree with them, then it is never a never-ending debate. How do we stop the cycle? And how do stop the cycle? And will they ever get to the point of just accepting the no or the boundary? They'll accept the boundary just after, well, not just after, sometime after we stop debating. And again, the shift from I'm right to this is just my boundary is an important and fundamental shift. You know, I have 4 children and a wife, and boundaries are difficult. This is not easy stuff. It's a life's work. It really, really, really is. So I'm with you. And our engagement in the defense or the justification is part of the problem. It is not a sign of strength and clarity and boundaries. It is a sign of non-boundaries. Harriet Lerner basically says, I'm paraphrasing a little bit in The Dance of Anger, my favorite book on boundaries. She says, a boundary is a boundary is a boundary is a boundary. Talking about boundaries, threatening boundaries, justifying boundaries, pleading, begging, arguing boundaries, those are not boundaries. So it takes a long time for all of us to make that shift because we weren't trained that way. We grew up in houses where people were right and people were wrong, not where people were just a self, and that was enough. All right. My next broadcast will be this Thursday. I'll take over it looks like we have lots of questions. I'll take over questions. My next is a much softer topic, how to bring joy back into the family life. That's this Thursday, a different time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. This Thursday, August 13th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. This particular broadcast will go on the podcast app in the next couple of days, so you can always find it there. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your passionate participation, your great attendance. I hope this is a nice bit of help for you as you're doing your work. And for and on behalf of your children, thank you for showing up. Take care. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.